royal house of Valois was the reigning monarchical house of France from the year 1328 to 1589. They didn't have the raw divine pomp and pageantry of their successors, the Bourbons. They didn't have the almost global conquest and European hegemony of Napoleon. And they certainly didn't have the high-minded ideals and brutal reality of the Revolution. But without them, none of the above would have been possible. So I ask that you join me, Sumatricus, as we explore their entire history across the course of centuries. Together, we shall delve into an often ignored section of French history. We shall explore how they came to power when no one, they themselves included, thought they would. We shall see how they grappled with the English in over 100 years of dynastic war. We shall study how their reforms set the groundwork for France to become a superpower. And we shall understand how they played the great game of politics, war, and nation building. This is the House of Valois. Hello, my troubadours, my dukes, and fans of all things history. Today we are kicking off the first episode of the House of Valois podcast, and what better place to start it than setting the scene with our first monarch of the House of Valois, Philip VI. So without further ado, let's kick it off. So Philip VI was born in 1293 at the Palace of Fontainebleau, which apparently means Fountain of Beautiful Water. We don't really know if that's an official designation it had, but that's what everybody said that it meant. So it's a nice little name. Anyway, Philip's father, Charles, was the Count of Valois and the younger brother of Philip IV. Charles had spent his life trying to gain more power for himself in France and in the French royal court, but he'd never really been able to dominate the political sphere or manage to lock himself in as a monarch of another European nation, which of course would have equaled him to his brother's prestige. I mean, this is the way these things go. The oldest gets the throne and the younger siblings just get to bugger off and have some dukedom or become a count or something. Now, when Charles died in 1325, he left Philip to inherit his lordship of the land of Valois, Anjou, and Maine. These provinces are either directly adjacent to or extremely close to the Ile-de-France, which translates into the Isle of France and is in reference to Paris being constructed on the island in the middle of the river Seine. These lands are, of course, pretty important, and it's all created in a system of buttressing the king. So the idea is that he has his loyal nobles who control the land around him, and subsequently they will defend the crown and they can be drawn upon for military resources or economic resources. Now, when Philip IV, Philip VI's uncle, was large and in charge, it looked like his dynasty, the Carpathian dynasty, was secure in their rule of France. Philip IV had 3 surviving sons and 1 grandson, but all 3 of these sons and the grandson would die without producing an heir, which feeds into this fun little historical narrative that we have called the Templars' Curse. Now, I'm sure all of you have heard of the Knights Templar. If not from reading or studying any kind of history, you've probably heard of them from the seminal Assassin's Creed games. Now, they had their origin as a crusading order, which, you know, went over in all the crusades and did a few unspeakable things. But when that all sort of fizzled out, they came back to France and set themselves up as a banking superpower. Now, it's not really what you think when you think of medieval knights, that they'd be, you know, lending money and all that kind of stuff, but that's what they were doing. So Philip IV had taken extraordinarily huge loans from the Knights Templar, and the Knights Templar were not answerable to the King of France. They answered directly to the Pope. So Philip was in a bit of a bind here. If they demanded the money back, they're going to use their extra royal authority to get it back, and there's nothing he can really do about it unless he wants to risk the ire of the Pope, who could lead him to be excommunicated, which would then mean that all other Catholic monarchs would have a direct claim on the crown of France, and there'd be nothing he could do about that. But luckily, Philip was able to get into his corner Clement V, the Pope. He was essentially a pawn of Philip. So, at daybreak on Friday the 13th, spooky day, October 1307, Philip IV destroyed the Order of the Knights Templar to claim both their wealth in money and land, and also to make sure that they can't recall his loans, because how are you going to recall a loan when you're dead? Now, this is actually pretty insane, because Philip captures multiple castles and he captures hundreds of Knights Templar with a level of military synchronization that is still studied today, considering that they didn't have radios or any kind of even basic communication that you have between large armies, say, for example, in the Napoleonic Wars with systems of flags or anything like that. Now, what happened is, because Philip controlled the Pope, they essentially set up a series of show trials, kangaroo courts, right? The Templars hadn't really done anything that was against the law or against the morals of the time, so Philip used his control over Clement to make sure that these guys were going to go down hard. So Philip had Clement proclaim them all as heretics, and they were all burned at the stake. They were all offered the standard system of like, oh, if you recant now, you'll save your soul, but we're still going to kill you, ha ha ha. So that's a bit of fun. Now, the Grand Master of the Templar Order, Jacques de Molay, showed apparently no fear when he was sentenced to death. And apparently, when they had him tied to the stake, he was to have said that God would avenge his order and would avenge himself against the King of France and Clement. And, you know, normally you consider this an empty threat, right? Like, what's Big Mac Daddy JC going to do? Nothing, right? But this time, the big dog stepped in. Within a year of Jacques' death, both Philip and Clement had died. Clement had died to a long series of illnesses, and Philip died of a stroke whilst out hunting. The rest of Philip's male children and one grandson then all passed away between the year 1314 and 1328. Now, it's important to realise as well that during this time, when we're running through all of Philip's heirs, our main focus, Philip VI, is still pretty large and in charge. He's a powerful lord in France, and he is actually considered a crucial advisor for these sons of his uncle. Excuse me. With the death of King Charles IV, who was Philip IV's last remaining male heir, Philip VI in 1328 was left with probably the best claim to the throne of France. But he wasn't the only one with a claim. There was also Edward III, King of England, who was the son of King Charles's sister Isabella. Now, 12 years earlier, Philip IV had assembled a body called the Estates General. Any of you who know your French Revolutionary history will, of course, know this. But the Estates General is composed of the three great estates of France. The first estate is the clergy, the second is the nobility, and the third estate is everybody else. Now, as I mentioned before, if you know your French Revolutionary history, you know this body all too well, because, of course, they finally wake up to the thing that it's a bit unfair that the 1% has two bodies and gets 2 votes, and everybody else only gets 1 vote. So, of course, the commoners are always getting outvoted by the interests of the elite. Now, what they had done is they had come together, the Estates General, and they had drawn from a thing called Salic law, which was composed in the year 500 by the Frankish king Clovis. There's a lot in this packet of laws, but the main thing to come out of it is that a person cannot inherit a throne or use a claim that's based upon a woman's claim to the throne, right? So this immediately wipes out Edward III's claim because he's getting it from Charles's sister. So that doesn't count. Sorry, superstar. She's a lady and you're done. So Philip VI is large and in charge, right? He is the main Mac Daddy, and he gets picked not to be king, but to be regent. Because when Charles died, his wife, Joan of Evreux, was pregnant. So they didn't know what sex the baby was going to be. So if she gave birth to a son, then Philip would have been regent for that child. But on the 1st of April, 1328, Joan gave birth to a daughter, and Philip was able to become the King of France. But there's a few foibles with this, right? So even though France drew from Salic law, a lot of other countries did not, right? So Philip was not a descendant or an heir of the original Joan of Navarre, whose inheritance of the Kingdom of Navarre and the counties of Champagne, Troyes, and Moreau, and Brie had been a personal union with the Crown of France for almost 50 years. Now, this means that these lands were all controlled by the Crown of France and had been intimately interwoven into the economic structure of the Crown of France. Now, it's important to realise here that during this feudal era of the High Medieval Age, there isn't a formalised system of tax. The central government doesn't exist, right? There's no everybody pays their income tax or anything like that. The way this works is that the king directly rules over certain lands, and from those lands he's able to draw tax income. He's also able to summon armies, and he is also able to draw from the other economic production of these lands, say, food or livestock or whatever's going on, right? Now, the way this works is France is, of course, split up into many different noble fiefdoms, dukedoms, counts, and all that kind of stuff. Each count, duke, or other noble is able to draw from the lands that they directly control, right? So, because Philip wasn't an heir to Joan of Navarre, he's about to lose at least 70% of his land that he can draw from, right? So that just ain't going to happen, right? Big Phil, he ain't doing that, right? He's going to get stuck in. So what he does is he goes to his second cousin, the future Joan II of Navarre. He goes to Joan and he decides that he is going to offer her a section of a huge package of land in the Duchy of Normandy, which is the top of France, the north of France, that borders the English Channel, or as it's known in French, the Sleeve. So he offers her these lands that are directly next to her husband's lands, of which she accepts because this is a nice little parcel that they can put together. And subsequently, she gives him back the counties of Champagne, Troyes, Morone, and Brie. So this means that Philip's economic base is reasonably well situated. Now, Philip's king, he's got his economic situation marginally sorted, right? I mean, we're still looking at a time of French history where it's extremely decentralized, right? You really do depend on the loyalty of your nobles or you're not getting anything done, right? So even though he's got his own little parcel, his own little area, he still is very dependent on the game of dynastic politics and keeping all his nobles in check and making sure that all his friends and family are in the right positions so he has allies when the time comes. So, Philip's now got his land sorted. So what does he do? First cab off the rank, so to speak. He goes into Flanders and reseats Louis I, who is Count of Flanders, who had been unseated by a popular revolution. Now, it's important to realise here that Flanders, today the modern Netherlands and Belgium, also known as the Low Countries, is an extremely egalitarian area of Europe. They really didn't believe in the system of monarchy, and even though they did have dukes who would rule over these areas, they did not believe in giving that duke an absolute system of monarchy. They did not believe in giving that one person absolute power. Now, you might think this is very great and modern. It's not really. It's a very oligarchical system, but it is more egalitarian than what we get in places, say, like Spain, or at this point, Castile, Aragon, or France. Now, it's also important to realise that the Low Countries are extremely developed. They're some of the richest lands in all of Europe, and whoever is in charge of them commands a massive amount of cash, trade. At this point, not much naval power, but still really, really high tier. Like, this is the definition of, for all my strategy gamers, a tall playthrough, right? So, and considering they're on the border of France, you want a fella who is your best mate here. Now, this area will, for a quick little tangent, go through so many different occupations, so many different conquests. I mean, it ends up being Austrian land, then it becomes the Royal House of Habsburg, then it goes through the Spanish throne. By the time we hit Louis XIV, the wars are still ongoing over there. When William of Orange becomes King of England, he specifically uses all the power of the British to fight Louis XIV for this area, right? So this is pretty big biggies, even though it might not really seem like it, but it is extremely important. So Philip reseats Louis I, Count of Flanders, right? Gets him back in there. Now, this is all well and good, except for the fact that this really pisses off Edward III, right? Edward III and Philip at this point had been on good terms, right? They didn't really have any beef. Edward was pretty happy ruling over England. He didn't really see the issue or the idea that he should be King of France. And even though he had certain factions within his court that were like, you should become King of France and King of England, he was not too keen on it. But reseating Louis I was essentially interfering in the English sphere of influence, right? So he does not rate that. But we're still all chill at this point in time, right? Now, strike number 2 comes when Philip offers sanctuary to David II of Scotland, gets him out of Scotland and brings him over to France, and then subsequently declares himself champion of David's interests in 1334. Now, this is arguably the beginning of France using Scotland as a sort of proxy war, right? What they'll do is they'll G up everything they can in Scotland, to the point that England, even though it wants to conquer Scotland or at least invade it and take what it can, can't really do it, because to do that would subsequently trigger war with France, and then you're fighting a war on two fronts, right? And what we also need to consider with that is we're talking about a time in which if your army gets wiped out, that's it. Like, we're not talking about local regiments or anything like that you can summon up. We're not even talking about multiple armies, right? These people really did live and die via the one battle that they would fight, especially considering that these kings would be on the front lines, leading the charge, usually in the cavalry. But if they were to die or get seriously injured, that's it. You know, you're done and dusted, right? So, what happens is that's 2 strikes for our boy Philip against Edward. Now, the final blow to English and French relations came when Edward III gave Robert of Artois refuge in England. Robert was a trusted advisor to Philip, but had committed forgery to try and obtain an inheritance. As a quick aside here, this is pretty par for the course, right? All the nobles, all the kings, they're always having these fraudulent documents drawn up. If you've ever seen how the Royal House of Habsburg claims that it's descendant from Achilles, that's all from this kind of stuff where it's like, we'll just lie about it and make it look really official and nobody can really tell us that it's not. But the aim of the game, even though it's accepted, is not to get caught. Robert got caught, and because he is a noble in France, that means that the jurisdiction for punishing him and delivering justice upon him belongs with our main man, Philip VI. But Edward III of England gives Robert refuge in England and essentially disobeys and also undermines the authority of Philip VI. And it's important to remember here that Edward III, being the patriarch of the Plantagenet family, wasn't just King of England. He was also Duke of Aquitaine. He controlled massive holdings in France, but as a French duke, he was technically supposed to be subordinate to Philip as King of France. It's a very odd system, because how can you be subordinate to the King of France when you're also the King of England, right? You're equal, but you're not in certain spheres. So this, of course, has always been a source of contention, and a few hundred years before this point, there was a thing called the Angevin Empire, in which the kings of France, as the Plantagenet house, controlled more of France than the King of France did, and they also had England, right? So Edward's given Robert refuge. Philip's furious, right? On the 26th of December, 1336, Philip demands that Robert is returned, to which Edward declines. Now, this could have been the moment that could have changed history, right? If Edward had just returned Robert, we probably wouldn't have had the 100 Years' War. We probably wouldn't have had all the things that go along with it. The 100 Years' War is actually longer than 100 years, if I'm correct in my rudimentary understanding of that. But Edward decides he's not going to do it, right? So on the 24th of May, 1337, Philip declared that Edward had forfeited the Duchy of Aquitaine for disobedience and for sheltering the king's mortal enemy. This is a direct quote here. So Aquitaine, extremely rich area of southwestern France. It's right on the border of the Atlantic Ocean, and it is beautiful. You really want it, right? It's a lot of trade power. It's a lot of extremely arable land, and the kings of France had often been eyeing it off, really wishing that they could get their hands on it, right? So, in response to what Philip's done here in 1337, Edward reasserts his claim to the throne of France, and the 100 Years' War has officially kicked off here. Now, it's important to realise as well, neither Philip nor Edward really wanted it to get to this point, right? They've got other concerns. Edward's concerned with the Scottish. Philip is concerned with the rising power of Castile. He's also concerned with dealing with the Holy Roman Empire at this point, which is the confederation of German princes who are then still at this point really powerful. They still control northern Italy and all this. So Philip especially has bigger fish to fry, right? And France is nowhere near close to its modern border that it has with Germany. I mean, we're talking all that's pretty locked off. Like, that still exists inside the empire. So Philip and Edward didn't really want it to get to this point. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to call it there. A few housekeeping things. Now, I am sorry that there's so many Philips and Charles in this single episode. I know it's a bit hard to follow along. I apologise for that. I would recommend, if you can, maybe give these guys a Google as you're listening to the episode, and then you'll be able to see their paintings and you'll be able to associate a little bit easier with their names. Other housekeeping issues. I am not a native French speaker, so if I've gotten any pronunciations incorrect or it's a bit cringe listening to me try to even do the pronunciations properly, let me know and I'll try and fix that all up. Next episode, we will be getting stuck into how Philip deals with the 100 Years' War, his part in it, and the beginning of all that. So, as a final note, one last thing, we do have socials. We've got Instagram and Twitter, just Symmetricus on all those platforms. We're also going to be uploading this episode to YouTube, so you should be able to find it there. Unfortunately, no visual component as of yet, but maybe in a few episodes' time, we'll get the webcam going. You can see my beautiful head. So, with that being said, my troubadours, my dukes, my fans of all things history, it has been an absolute pleasure. I have been Symmetricus, and I'll see you for episode 2 of the House of Valois.